let's go back to 2020 and just remind ourselves what Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock were saying with great confidence about care homes and Covid.
We brought the lockdown in care homes ahead of the general lockdown.
Right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
We absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care, and I'm glad we've been able to protect the majority of homes, and we'll keep working to strengthen the protective ring that we've cast around all our care homes.
Well, there was no protective ring. 41,000 vulnerable care home residents, 41,000, died of Covid between March 2020 and April this year in England and Wales alone.
Well, today, two daughters who lost their fathers in outbreaks at their separate care homes begin landmark action against the government. They claim the failure to protect care residents was unlawful. One of those daughters is virologist Dr. Cathy Gardner. She lost her dad, Michael Gibson. She's bringing the action against the government and joins us now. Good morning to you, Dr. Gardner, but a very, sad day as you remember your lovely dad. Tell viewers what happened to him. It was in the early stages, wasn't it, of the pandemic, at the time that the Health Secretary was claiming to be protecting care home residents.
Yes, my father became ill in mid-March 2020, which was, for those of us in the general public, just so early. It never occurred to me that he could have Covid, and he was never tested. But the GP that saw him was pretty sure that that's what it was, and sadly, he died on the 3rd of April.
He was 88 years old. His name's Michael Gibson. And the reason that you believe he died was because he contracted Covid after a patient who had Covid was discharged to his care home from hospital. Now, this was highly criticised, of course, in the report that just came out from MPs. This was seen as one of the worst public health failures we've ever seen. What do you think about it broke the law? Because to take legal action over it is an important step, isn't it?
It's a very important step. For a healthy democracy, it's vital that we can hold the government to account. These laws, which are human rights laws and equality laws, are very, very fundamental. A government has a legal duty to look after its citizens in the decisions that it takes and the things that it does and the things that it doesn't do. And we believe very strongly that the government broke several laws. We know that the protective ring didn't exist, and now we want to challenge the decisions that they made.
We know, don't we, that when a law is broken, a great deal of the legal argument in a court, if it comes to court, is about intent. What was the intention when the law was broken? And if I can play devil's advocate here, the government would say, and this was said in the report a few days ago, that the reason that people were sent home from hospitals, elderly people, back to care homes, was because there was a real fear that the hospitals were about to be overwhelmed, and that it was felt in good conscience that by sending elderly people back to their care homes, when they seemed to be physically fit enough to travel, they would be possibly better cared for in the care home, in more spacious surroundings. They wouldn't be in a packed ward. It might be actually better for them, as well as being better for the hospital. That was the intent behind it. Do you accept that? Do you accept that that was the rationale at the time?
It's an interesting point to put. I understand that side of the argument, but unfortunately, they also have a legal duty to protect the residents of care homes. And it's that missing part that means that I'm standing here today. What struck me at the time from the discharge policy was that it focused entirely on the well-being of those patients being discharged from hospital, with absolutely no regard, apparently having been given, to the welfare of the residents living in the homes. If you remember at the time, and please allow me to say this, that in the middle of March, those over 70, those who were vulnerable, clinically vulnerable, were told to stay at home. Isolate yourself from your friends, your family, protect yourselves. My father had no choice in that. He was relying on protection from everybody else around him, and he didn't get that. and neither did the tens of thousands of other residents of care homes.
No, and Richard mentioned at the beginning of this interview that 41,000 people died, care home residents died. That's up to the period of this year. But the shocking thing to me is that half of that number died in those first couple of months of 2020. More than 20,000 care home residents died from COVID between March and June 2020. I mean, it was the death toll was just shocking in that couple of months. But you know, we can see the scale of it was devastating, but for an individual to lose your father at a time when we were all terrified of COVID, as you say, the advice had been to shelter, to protect yourself, to isolate. We dropped testing. People were not being tested when they left hospital. You weren't able, were you, Dr. Gardner, to be with your father when you knew he was going to die? How were you able to say goodbye to him? Because that's one of the cruelties of what happened early on.
Everything surrounding the deaths, particularly in those early months, was just so abnormal and so traumatic for everybody. I had the fortune, if I can say that word, to know that I could go and see my father through a window because he was in a ground floor room. I felt I needed to do that. I needed to travel from where I live in Devon to Oxfordshire just to be able to see him. And he died about 24 hours later. And that gave me a lot of comfort to have done that. But I also feel so sad for those families who couldn't visit relatives in hospital and certainly couldn't go inside care homes at all. And if my father had been upstairs, I wouldn't have been able to see him at all.
What would you say, and there'll be viewers who'll be typing these messages in as we speak, I can guarantee it, people who will be deeply sympathetic to what happened and to your ordeal and to your father's early death, but who will nevertheless say that you are speaking with hindsight, that you are speaking now all the facts are known. I mean, for example, when did the penny drop in your head? When did you realise that the reason that your dad had died was because somebody had been sent home with the illness? When did that take shape in your mind?
I cannot pin my father's death on any one individual. My father was never tested, and it's impossible to know actually in those early days what went on. But this is not about hindsight, this is about the law. The government has a duty to consider the decisions it is taking and to protect its citizens. That's a fundamental law. They need to demonstrate that they properly considered how to protect the most vulnerable and the impact of any decisions they took, like hospital discharge, onto them. This is not about judging what happened. This is not a public inquiry. This is about forward thinking, what we rely on the government to do, planning, understanding the risks and making careful, considered decisions. And we believe that they did not do that as far as care homes were concerned.
What will a successful prosecution, let's assume that you're successful here, just for the sake of argument, and that's by no means certain, what would a successful prosecution change? What would it do?
As I said before, it's very, very important for a healthy democracy for a government to really be held to account, to make sure that this never happens again. The government must consider its decisions. It must listen to the advice that it's given. It must weigh up everything that it does and make sure that it's not doing anything that's directly harmful to people. That is vital. This probably won't be the last pandemic. It may not be the last time they have to make these kinds of decisions. They cannot be so cavalier and reckless and negligent again.
Can you tell us what the last thing was that your father said to you?
That's quite difficult to remember. The last time I had a conversation with him was in February 2020. At that point, he had dementia, but he was quite happy, quite content and calm. He was very peaceful. He was talking about little things in his room, and I was there with my mother, visiting him in February, and we had no idea at that point that we wouldn't see him face to face again.
Dr. Gardner, we will follow your legal action with great interest. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A government spokesperson has said every death is a tragedy, and they work tirelessly to protect the public from the threat to life and health posed by the pandemic, and specifically sought to safeguard care homes and their residents. And of course, That is precisely the issue at stake today, whether they stuck to their legal duty to protect life.